Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 5, where we will be covering chapter 5, learning. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we are skipping chapter 4 for now. That is the chapter on consciousness. We will cover it a little bit later on. I usually do this just because it's a preference of mine to cover the learning material before we get to consciousness. So we will be covering it, but I just want you to be aware of that so that you're not starting into chapter 4 just thinking that we're going in order. So for this week, we are covering the topic of learning. If we look down here into the objectives, what does learning mean? What does that cover? Well, it is like it sounds. We're pretty much looking at the various ways in which psychology has found that people learn. Okay, we learn through many different avenues, and there's been some great research done in the field to determine, what are the best methods for learning that we have been able to show, actual research to support. So we'll be taking a look. Actually, the chapter kind of breaks down into 3 sort of sections. The first section will be taking a look at classical conditioning. So some of you have probably heard of Pavlov and how he conditioned dogs, right? That's one of the most popular sort of experiments in psychology that people hear about. So you'll be taking a look at that original experiment, but more importantly, looking at the different elements of classical conditioning. How can you condition in an emotional response? Okay. How can you get somebody to do something that they're not even aware that they ever learned to do? So a lot of it happens at the subconscious level, and it really is just the association of things. Okay, so you're associating one thing with another thing, and you're doing that kind of at a level that happens outside of your awareness. Okay, so we call that like a subconscious level. So that's sort of like the first part of the book is going to cover that in the chapter. And then it's going to move into operant conditioning. And that's largely the work of first Thorndike and then Skinner, who picked up and really developed the area of operant conditioning further. And operant conditioning is what operates on a punishment reward sort of system. Okay, so the fact that we are rewarded for certain behaviors, we are punished for others, and we learn from that. And so behaviors are contingent upon that learning. So we're either going to engage in activities or behaviors that we're rewarded for or not when we're punished. And so you'll be learning more of the details, kind of the nitty gritty of how operant conditioning can work and be effective in a number of different applied settings. You'll be breaking it down between different types of reinforcers that can be used, such as positive and negative reinforcement. They have different effects and they're used a little differently. But this is the kind of thing that you see being used in classrooms. You see it being used with dog training, in the police force. So many different applied settings. And there's many different what they call schedules of reinforcement. So you can train individuals based on how often you reinforce them, or when you reinforce them. For what is it that they're doing that they're getting reinforced? How often does that occur? Is it on a timed basis? Is it on a response basis? Like, every 4 responses gets a reward, or is it every 20 minutes you get a reward? What would that look like? So that's what the schedules of reinforcement covers. And then you'll kind of be comparing and contrasting a little bit reinforcement with punishment. What is the more appropriate type of learning when we're looking at those two? What gets the best results? And there's definitely some discussion there about using physical punishment, and that's really a deterrent. But we'll be taking a look at some of the research there as well. Okay, so that's kind of like the middle part of the chapter, covers operant conditioning, and then you will get into what's sort of in a kind of broad overview called observational learning, and that's all of this stuff here actually. Latent learning, insight learning, learned helplessness, which is connected to depression, are all sort of forms of observational learning where we learn by our experiences around us, by watching and taking in the world around us. And even more specifically, we learn by the types of models that we're observing, okay, either inadvertently or on purpose, okay? A lot of times our parents are our models, or our teachers are our models, or just the people around us, our peers, become our models in adolescence. And so what kind of effect does that have? How strong of a pull does that have on our behavior when we consider what models are doing? How do we use that? There's some positive aspects and some negative aspects. So we'll largely be learning about the work of Albert Bandura, who was a huge researcher in psychology that looked at the role of models and watching by observation, watching by just looking at what others are doing. So that's pretty much the chapter. It's broken down nicely into those three kind of components. And so it's a good way to kind of digest the material for the week. You have your lecture slides. The videos that you're going to be watching this week are all in episode 7, which is learning, and there's some great ones in there. Again, you'll see some videos from Skinner, from Pavlov, and from Bandura, and just some really great examples. Some of the classical conditioning, it's hard to get the hang of it. It's hard to get used to what it means because a lot of terms are used. So in classical conditioning, you'll be talking about different kinds of stimuli and different kinds of responses, whether they're happening before conditioning takes place or after conditioning takes place. They're called different things. So just getting a hang of the language is a little bit of the battle. And I think that watching the videos is really helpful because you can go back and watch them as many times as you want until you feel like you have the language down pretty well. And your book also has some really great examples in it of things you can put on note cards that might be helpful as well. In addition, I'm attaching this worksheet here. This isn't due. This isn't anything that is an assignment. All really it is meant to do for you here is provide you with some extra examples. So it's basically a worksheet that asks you to identify the variables involved in classical conditioning and operant conditioning, but it gives you a whole bunch of different scenarios. So here's something that's happening. Can you identify, is it classical or operant conditioning? And then secondly, if it is classical, what is the conditioned stimulus? What is the unconditioned stimulus? What's the conditioned response? What's the unconditioned response? So you're again getting used to those terms and identifying those within a classical conditioning scenario. And then if it's operant conditioning, it gives you some examples of the punishment versus reward, as well as positive and negative reinforcement. And it's getting you used to understanding when is positive reinforcement being used, when is negative reinforcement being used, so that you get used to those kinds of applied situations. And that's largely what you get tested on. If you've noticed so far, just from the tests that we took, a lot of the questions aren't just, define this or explain this, but they're sometimes giving you a scenario and then asking you to identify the concept that's happening or the concept that's at play. And that's really how you take psychology and you bridge it to real life and real behavior. It's great to learn about all these concepts and things in class and be able to define them, but it's a whole nother thing to be able to actually apply that which you're learning to human behavior that you see happening in the real world. So again, the worksheet's just meant to give you some practice. You can do it with other people from the class if that helps. This is something that you can actually talk about in the student lounge. So if you want to post questions to one another or answer back and forth, that's a great use of the Student Lounge discussion board that we have. If you go back up here into the Communications tab and you just click into the Student Lounge, I'll do it real quick so you can see. Here's Student Lounge. It's where you posted your bio at the beginning of the semester. So if you go into there, that gives you the opportunity to ask each other questions. Hey, what'd you get on this one? Why? That kind of thing. So I feel like this will just give you extra practice. And then when the week is done, I will go ahead and post the answers to that worksheet, which hopefully will help you out. Your discussion for this week deals with Hawk reading number 12. And that is called See Aggression, Do Aggression. It is based on Bandura's research of observational learning. It's actually Bandura, Ross, and Ross. They were the three co-authors that ran that experiment. It was an experimental study looking at type of model, aggressive versus non-aggressive, and how that affected kids. So based on the type of model kids saw, how was their resulting behavior? So you're taking a look at that original study from the 60s, and then you're asked to sort of contemplate how that has a far-reaching effect for society today. Like, how does this original research still give a continuing influence today in our world? Thinking about, the ways in which we see aggression today are very different from the 60s, where, even then not everyone had a TV in their home. And today everyone has a TV in their bedroom, and not just television, but video games and phones and iPads, where it is a constant sort of media information feed with access to aggressive models. So I kind of want you guys integrating that. And again, remember when you're doing these discussion posts that you should be integrating not only the Hawk reading, but also the chapter on learning. So what concepts from the main chapter can you apply to answering this question, right? Because the main chapter talks a ton about observational learning, stuff that was not in this article here. So that is a great opportunity to show me that you did the reading and you're able to then go ahead and transfer what you learned into answering these questions, okay? And I just want to give a little kind of side note that, you should be doing your original posts on your own. You should not be looking at what other people are writing and then going and doing yours, because when they start to sound very similar, I'm suspicious of who's coming up with their own information versus who's looking at other people's responses and then writing theirs. If I ever find responses that are too similar, you may get called out on that, okay? And that would happen privately, but I feel like that needs to be said. It is an issue of academic honesty, especially in an online class where you shouldn't be and can't be taking material that belongs to someone else and passing it off as your own. So I just want everyone to be aware of that. I always say that in all my classes because, unfortunately sometimes that happens. So just make sure that when you're going to sit down and write your original post, that you write it from your own understanding of the material, that you haven't yet looked at anybody else's stuff, okay? The time for looking at other people's posts comes when you've already written your original response and now you've waited a day or two and you're going back in and you're seeing what people wrote and then you're commenting on what they wrote. And again, when you're commenting on what they wrote, you're incorporating in the material. Is there something they didn't say that they could have? Can you elaborate more on something that they said? Can you give some extra examples? Those are all great ways to really develop your post if you're looking for that kind of 10-point post, okay? That's all for that. Quiz number 4 is this week, due by Friday, and your second exam will be due by Sunday, and that rounds off the week. And definitely, as you're working on things, please let me know if you need any help or you have any questions. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a great week.